I will present today a new project that I'm carrying out together with Martin Neugebauer at the Free University of Berlin. Among all the projects and papers you saw today, I think this will be the most early stage work, because we only started this project really a few weeks ago. I also started my position in Berlin a few weeks ago. So this is really the first considerations and design phase we are in right now. The project is titled The Labor Market Consequences of Dropping Out from Higher Education. And I will present you a short overview of the entire project, which we will be actually carrying out over the next 3 years. That is a bit broader. And then I'll dig a bit deeper into one aspect we are focusing on right now. And we are really in the phase of designing the experiment. So any questions, comments, whatever, are really helpful at this stage. Okay. To start this, no, I can't click. All right, okay, perfect. So this project overview, so what's the motivation behind looking at the labor market consequences of dropout? Well, really simple. It's a really relevant topic also because up to 30% of students actually do not complete their higher education degrees. So we see each year millions of students, basically millions of young adults who enter the labor market after having failed at obtaining the last degree that they attempted to obtain. At the same time, research at this on the school-to-work transition focuses mostly on successfully obtained degrees. So there is quite some research, but then it's rarely taken into consideration that students might have failed at obtaining a degree in the last phase of their education. And there's obviously also some research on dropouts, but this focuses really more on the causes of dropout and preventing dropout, but not so much of the consequences, and in particular the labor market consequences or the labor market perspectives. The research that there is on the consequences of labor market dropout is a lot. There's quite some observational data research, surveys with former students, but it suffers from the typical problems here, like inadequate control of confounders. And also it's difficult in this research to directly compare dropouts to competitors and to get really behind the causal effect of dropout. And also the test of mechanisms here is difficult. So there has been some experimental research previously with Factorial service and then with employers. So really focusing on the receiving side of the school-to-work transition. And this has been done by the group in which I'm working in now in a previous project. So there have been some Factorial service employers, where employers rated vignettes of dropouts, and also in comparison to applicants with completed degrees. But it has been quite limited in a sense that these vignettes all were male and native majority background applicants in Germany, and only a few occupations have been studied in business and IT. And they address some of the mechanisms already, but there are many more mechanisms, potential mechanisms behind labor market integration of dropouts that still need to be studied. So this is where this sort of follow-up project, and for me, first project in this topic comes in, where we try to extend this research on the experimental research. And we will also focus on the demand side of the school-to-work transition to investigate the consequences of dropout. So we will focus on employers as gatekeepers for the transition to school, from school to work, and see how employers actually evaluate applicants with a dropout experience. And we see in this process, in this hiring process, employers as rational actors who want to hire applicants, employees with a high productivity and low training costs. But they also make decisions under uncertainty, because they don't directly observe this productivity, but they have to rely on signals of productivity, where dropout is probably one of very salient signals of productivity. But there are also others, of course, such as GPA or signals of motivation and so on, which could mitigate or exacerbate the effect of a dropout. And employers also evaluate candidates in comparison to each other, usually according to this job queue theory. So it's also important who are the other applicants, and we try to take this into account in the experiments that we actually want to run. And we focus on the German labor market, which is also sort of particular because it has a strong vocational training component that we also will consider. But this is the setting of our research. The overall research question is what is the cause and effect of dropping out from higher education on, and then we look at being invited to a job interview as one stage of the hiring process. And we look at this question against two counterfactuals. So on the one hand, what if the dropout had never started higher education? And in this condition, we look at, or this counterfactual, we look at apprenticeship positions, so the vocational training market. So these dropouts compete with applicants coming directly from high school diploma. And on the other hand, we look at what if the dropout had completed the higher education degree that they started. And here we look at higher education graduate positions. And then also the dropouts compete with other applicants who have actually successfully completed their higher education degree. And from the previous project, we know already on this general research question that on the apprenticeship market, dropouts actually have a small advantage compared to applicants with only high school diploma who never started studying at university or college. But on the graduate market, they have a strong disadvantage compared to those who completed their program. And we want to extend on this more general question by also studying more topics around this question, but also diversify, so to speak, the setting in which we study the research question. So first point here is that we will look at mechanisms more deeply. So actually, what exactly does a dropout signal? Is it, for example, a lack of motivation or skills? But it could also be an advantage in experience compared, for example, to someone who has only a high school diploma. So this is one question where we will directly, with the dependent variable, also ask employers about how they perceive dropouts. We want to study group differences, as I already mentioned. So not only look at male and native majority applicants, but also want to see whether the effect of a dropout varies across demographic groups, ethnic groups or migration background, gender and socioeconomic status. Then we have a study planned on homophily, actually, where we want to look at the similarity between the recruiter and the applicant, and whether the similarity can mitigate, for example, a negative effect of a dropout on the graduate market. And in particular here, would be interesting to see whether if the recruiter or employer also has a dropout experience in their own biography, whether this might help dropouts actually getting hired or invited for an interview. But we also more broadly want to look at cultural similarity between the recruiter and the applicant in terms of similar leisure preferences or other cultural preferences, and demographics, so gender and ethnicity of the recruiter. Then, this is also very broad, I'm aware of this, we want to look at differences across labor market segments. So whether the effect of a dropout varies across fields of study and across labor market segments. Sorry. And here I already mentioned that we will look at the apprenticeship market, but also at graduate positions. And we will not only, as the previous project, look at IT and business positions, but extend this to natural sciences and humanities, the fields of studies which dropouts are coming from, to have a broader set of occupations where these dropouts are going to. And finally, we want to make sort of a methodological contribution, because I was talking now a lot about the Factorial surveys, and this is also a method that we will use a lot in this project, but it is still fairly unclear whether the behavioral intentions studied in stated in Factorial surveys always translate to actual behavior, as you might know. And one idea that we have, and that I want to talk about a bit more in the remainder of my presentation, is we want to try to validate the results of Factorial survey on this topic using a field experiment where we actually want to send applications to employers. And I will go into this a bit more in detail in a moment. The experiments that we plan in the overall project are actually 4 factorial survey experiments, where employers are invited to rate vignettes of fictitious job applicants. So in this condition, the employers know that these job applicants are fictitious, and they get profiles of those, you might all know this, and then rate how likely they are to invite these applicants for a job interview for the job that they're advertising. And the 4 factorial surveys come about by looking at the apprenticeship and the graduate market, and at the 2 fields of studies and the pertaining occupations in the natural sciences and the humanities. And then finally, we want to run 1 field experiment where employers receive fictitious application on their real job ads. And with this field experiment, we want to compare the results of this field experiment with one of the 4 factorial surveys that we're running above. And I already have to say that which of the 4 is still to be determined. This is also one of the points I'm raising in the remainder of this presentation. All right, so now I will go a bit deeper into what I call the validation study, so this last contribution. I will present you a bit the idea behind it, theoretical and the motivation, and then I will mostly present it to you in terms of design challenges. So we've already made some decisions on the design, but there are also still quite a lot of open questions, and I'm aware that this is still very early stage, but here we are for feedback. So if you have any ideas on solving these challenges, then we would be very happy. Okay, so the motivation behind this validation study is, as I already said, that factorial surveys have become increasingly popular for studying a wide variety of social science research questions, but also they're becoming increasingly popular in the field of hiring studies. There are good reasons for this, I think, but because on a practical level, they are less costly than field experiments, easier to run, there are less risks of being discovered, less ethical issues, the sample is easier to recruit. This is why I think a lot of researchers are also using these factorial surveys. And they're a really nice instrument also because they typically allow to study more different dimensions of applicants than field experiments, because each employer can rate many more vignettes than they can receive fictitious applications. But yeah, the question remains, how valid are actually these factorial surveys, and do the behavioral intentions stated in them translate to the behavior actually shown in the hiring process? And this is an attempt that we want to do with validating our factorial survey design with a field experiment. Why would these behavioral intention not translate to behavior? So there are some threats to behavioral validity. First, in general, the intention-behavior relationship depends on a lot of factors, but one factor here in particular is level of costs that a certain behavior will have, and high costs make the realization of intentions less likely. So for example, in the course of hiring, it's easy to state discrimination-free hiring in the factorial survey, but if you're actually hiring a person, then this of course also has more consequences for the employer. So they might actually not live up to their stated intentions here. The second point would be so-called hypothetical bias. So, of course, the vignettes are always an incomplete reconstruction of reality. They might be shorter, less detailed than an actual application. Employers might not perceive them as real and act differently upon the vignettes than on the actual application. And third, I think this is the most commonly mentioned one, is that there's desirability bias, so that in the factorial survey, even if the factorial survey is well done, employers might actually also see through the manipulation or see which dimensions are varied, and their answers might be distorted by the need for social approval they have. There is some previous research that focuses particularly on this topic of validating factorial or survey of factorial survey results. The evidence is quite mixed on whether these survey results translate to real-world behavior. And then there are two studies specifically on hiring discrimination. And both of them find that factorial survey results actually are not valid in the sense that they don't translate to results of a field experiment. However, these two studies have only looked at topics with a relatively high or strong social desirability, so ethnic discrimination and the hiring of ex-offenders. And they also have not attempted really to reduce hypothetical bias. So they have not tried, for example, to align the vignettes in the factorial survey to a high extent to the field experiment condition. So these stand a bit more apart from each other, the two types of experiments in these studies. And they also have used different sampling procedures in general for factorial surveys and field experiments, which also makes it harder to compare the results of the two experimental studies. And then there is a study by Petzel and Worbring. Then the study is not on hiring, but is a lost letter design, misdirected emails, so where people get an email and then this one email that is obviously misdirected, and the question is whether they forward or reply to this misdirected email. And they do find behavioral validity in their study. And what they really try to do, and what we also want to attempt, is they really closely align their factorial survey and their field experiment to minimize hypothetical bias. So using the same sample and using a very similar design for the materials. They also work, this is also on ethnic discrimination. So the question remains, this is a topic with high social desirability bias potentially. How does this translate to other topics? And their setting is a really low-cost setting, so forwarding an email doesn't have very high consequences for the respondents. So this is definitely also different from hiring. So what we want to do is, as I already said, we want to add a validation study in the field of hiring to the two that I already mentioned, or the two that we are aware of. So this is a setting with relatively high costs. It is not directly about hiring, but about an interview invitation, but still the recruiter invests considerable amount of time in this applicant. So there are definitely costs for the recruiter. And then we want to really minimize hypothetical bias by doing what I call an aligned design. So we definitely want to use the same sampling procedure for both experiments, and also closely align the design of vignettes and applications. And this is where we're still at the moment, thinking about how to do this best. It's also the first field experiment on hiring of dropouts, as far as we are aware. So this might be also a standalone contribution. And fourth, what we plan to do is we want to tease out this aspect of social desirability a bit by comparing two dimensions of hiring discrimination. So our dropout topic and the penalty of dropout, and compare it to ethnic discrimination. Just a bit more on these two dimensions. So for dropout, there's actually very few factorial survey studies, and as far as we know, no field experiment to this date. And dropout, we are perceiving as a topic that has relatively weak social norms. So for the behavior of the employer here, one could even say that this is a form of meritocratic discrimination, not to hire a dropout because a dropout is missing a degree, or they might miss certain skills that an employer actually has as a requirement for a job ad. So this is a condition or a dimension where we think social desirability will be relatively low. And therefore validity in between factorial survey results and field experiment rather high. Then ethnic discrimination, as you all know, is a very well-studied topic, and there are both field experiments, but also factorial surveys on this topic. And this is also a form of discrimination that is routinely found in these field experiments. And this is also, as I already mentioned, where social norms are quite strong, and discrimination by ethnicity is also illegal in many places. So the potential social desirability bias in the Factorial survey experiment is relatively high. So we also expected validity here might be lower because of this relatively high social desirability. Okay, and now to the design challenges. So I think I have about 10 minutes left for that. So where do we stand at this moment? So the first thing we're still challenged with is choosing a labor market segment for our study. And we've basically decided to run this field experiment on the apprenticeship market for mostly practical reasons, but we're still a bit sad about this decision in a sense. The reason why we want to do the apprenticeship market is because the applications there are much more standardized. One thing that is really Germany specific is that you really send in the first stage of the hiring process, you send copies of all your diplomas to your employer. So this means also for the apprenticeship market, younger applicants who come directly from high school, that we have less diplomas that we need to fake, so to speak. I think this is also, to our knowledge, there's no field experiment in the German labor market for graduate positions, and we think this might actually be the reason, because it is really difficult to fake university diplomas for legal, but more also for like practical reasons and ethical issues you might run into with these universities. So we have decided to do the apprenticeship market, but it's a bit of a pity, because in the graduate market, we think that there would be probably a larger effect for dropout. As has been seen in this previous research, the dropout effect is rather small in the apprenticeship market. So we only have also a small or maybe even a null effect here in both experiments. And then also the graduate market would lend itself to higher international comparability, because the apprenticeship market is something very particularly German. And it might also be the more convincing counterfactual, because when you think of dropout, you might think of a comparison with those who did not drop out but complete. And then the field of study, I think this will mostly depend on which field offers occupations that are suitable. So basically occupations that offer enough job advertisements in a certain period of time that we can apply to. Sorry. So the second challenge that I want to present is the sampling procedure. So how we see the sampling right now is that we want to define first the occupations of interest, where we have enough job advertisements. Then we'll go to the job search platforms and look for advertisements, obtain contact details of the recruiters from these job ads, and then actually split up in the two experiments, our sample. So one condition will be the Factorial survey. We'll get sent a Factorial survey, and the field experiment condition will get sent a fictitious application. And this will happen on the fly, because for the field experiment condition, we need to reply to these ads in a timely manner. So we won't collect contact details for months and then send out the survey to everyone in the end, but we will on the fly randomly assign job ads to these two conditions and then apply to these jobs or send a Factorial survey. And then afterwards, in the Factorial survey condition, we will send a short survey that will come with the Factorial survey and be shown after the vignettes that gives us more information about the recruiters themselves. And we also plan to do this in the field experiment conditions. So after a while, after the application process is closed, send also short survey to the employers. And one reason we're doing this is to just get information from the recruiters, but we're also thinking one issue that we see is that in a Factorial survey, we will definitely have a high share of non-response. In the field experiment, by definition, we will have complete data, because if you look at the callback rate, it's either callback or not. So we think that this might be good for a robustness check to look only at the sample of employers that also reply to this short survey in both conditions. So this is one idea behind this short survey at the end. There's also something alternative that we're still a bit thinking about, but I don't know what you think about it. So it would also be an idea to maybe just do a factorial survey with all of these, to send a fictitious application to all of these job ads, and a few months later send a factorial survey to the same employers, which would be nice because we also could study within employer effects, and we also would have need only, I wrote it down here, half of the sample to get the same power basically. But we also see the risk of period effects if there are a few months in between. And there will be definitely a high risk of discovery, especially if you want to align the vignettes very much to the actual applicants, maybe even using the same names, etc. So I think this is a reason not to do this sampling strategy. Okay, then my third challenge, that is the design of the vignettes in the fictitious applications. Sorry, my voice is a bit difficult today. And here we have some design goals, and one design goal, as I already mentioned, is minimize the hypothetical bias, so get to a really close alignment between the factorial survey and the field experiment. But we also want to create an optimal standalone design for both of the two experiments. And as I will talk about in a moment, there might be some trade-offs between these two goals. So just a short overview over the dependent and independent variables that we intend to study in this vignettes applications. So in the vignettes, the dependent variable will be on the one hand a continuous measure, so it will be a rating scale in percentages with the probability. So the employer indicates the probability to invite a specific applicant for an interview. Because and then we will add a second dependent variable, which will be a forced choice in the end of the employers will see all the vignettes, and then will be forced to actually make a selection between the applicants, which they invite then for an interview. And the second dependent variable will more closely then align with the applications in the field experiment, where the employer also gives a dichotomous response, either calls back the applicant for an interview or not. And the main independent variables will be basically 3 dimensions that we vary. So dropout in ethnicity, or in probably migration background that we want to signal in our case. And then as a third one, gender, because we want to extend on this previous project that only studied male applicants. However, in the vignette condition, I think we will also potentially vary more dimensions. Also because, and this is the next point here, we want to make the vignettes as realistic as possible. So this also means that we want to vary many, more than just 3 dimensions to make them more realistic, and also make the manipulation, make it less easy to see through the manipulation, basically. On the other hand, for the field experiment, it is definitely not possible to vary more than 3 dimensions, and this is already a lot. And then the second point with complexity here is also that in the vignettes, ideally, you don't want to have lengthy information to read through. So ideally, no entire cover letter. But the applications in the field experiment definitely will have to have a cover letter as to appear as a real application. So this is still a trade-off we're struggling with, how we can align the 2 conditions ideally, while still keeping them functioning for the standalone experiment. And one thing that also comes to mind with the vignettes is that the more information we add, we will also decrease social desirability, hopefully. Because it will get more complex for employers to actually act in a social desirable way. And we will also probably decrease statistical discrimination because they have more information on the applicants. And these 2 counteract each other. So less social desirability will probably lead to a stronger effect of discrimination, but less social discrimination to a weaker effect. So this is also something we are still considering what this actually does. Okay, and then finally this here, about the amount of vignettes, also still about the design. So the employers will definitely get a set of vignettes that they have to rate. So we will create a situation in which the employer actually has to evaluate applicants in comparison. And I heard yesterday that this is actually what's normally not done in Factorial service, that so that employers are actually supposed to independently rate vignettes. But in our situation, actually, we think we want them to compare the applicants to each other, so to have as a pool of comparison. And in the field experiment condition, we are thinking of just sending randomly assigned single application per employer, so not an application per level of the dimensions that we vary, because we already have 3 dimensions, and this seems not feasible to send 8 applications to each employer, because they might not even get so many applications. And this single application then will compete with other real world applications. So then one final short point, and then I'm done. One potential pitfall we're seeing, and this is the fourth challenge, when maybe you have some ideas on this, and this is really still very open. So on the apprenticeship market, we expect only a small or maybe even a null effect for especially dropout in the Factorial survey condition. And the question is it possibly to convincingly validate a null effect? Because obviously it could also, there's a host of reasons why dropout might not be a salient dimension for employers. So maybe we really have to make sure then that the manipulation works. I mean, we can check this to a certain extent, but I think it would probably be more convincing to validate an actual effect. But yeah, I would just be curious what your thoughts are on this issue. And yeah, that's what we have so far. And thank you for your attention. And I'm very happy to get any suggestions.
Thank you very much, Andrea, for this presentation, especially considering that you're not feeling super well today. So thank you so much. And Hana, if you would like to go ahead with your presentation. And I want to apologize. I realize that now you're associate professor, so my bad.
That's okay.
All right.
Not at all. Okay, I'll just get my PowerPoint up. Right. Okay, does that work? Okay, thank you to the organizers for doing this. It's exciting to see it and exciting to get a broader view of what kind of experimental work is going on. And thanks to Andrea and Martin for the chance to read your paper, your proposal. So a lot of my comments are, in the spirit of, as this is sort of a developing project, in the spirit of nailing down pieces of the design. And some of my assumptions, I think, are based on assumptions about the US market. So we can also, you can, flag those assumptions whenever they come up. As you can see, this is an extremely ambitious project. There's a lot of goals that the researchers have, and it's a nice addition. I think the studying of this particular feature of the trajectory through education and work experience and the effects in the labor market adds to a literature that extends beyond the sort of focus on racial discrimination. And I think it sort of maps on to work by, for instance, like David Padula, who studied non-standard work trajectories, the effect of non-standard work trajectories on employer decisions about hiring, and then also actually some of Kwan's other work on the effect of like freelancing in someone's work experience on callbacks. So I think it sort of builds on that kind of much smaller than the racial discrimination literature, but builds towards that a better understanding of work experience and education in terms of their labor market effects specifically. Okay, so I had some organizing questions and then sort of a lot of thoughts about design, and hopefully this can be sort of a ongoing, more of a conversation given the state of the project. But I started with the question of sort of, for you as researchers of the effects of dropping out, specifically, what are the most valuable things to learn from an experimental design? And so there's obviously the kind of, binary thing to learn. Is there discrimination? So that's like sort of that it restricts future employment opportunities. There's a piece of what you're interested in that's about, for whom does dropping out most restrict these future employment opportunities? And then this third piece, which I think it's latent in, what you talked about, but sort of, thinking really carefully about what are the mechanisms by which dropping out restricts future employment opportunities. So a lot of my comments are particularly about thinking about opportunities in the design to think more about mechanisms, but obviously sort of, it depends on what your main goals are for the project in terms of which of these you are most important to show at this phase. I will also say, I think, as you were speaking, I think given how many goals you have, I wonder if it makes sense to think about kind of phases of this project in terms of helping experimental design, in the sense of, being able to kind of reduce the number of things you're trying to address at any one time, and think about, phasing which questions you answer first, second, and third. And I think that might also help kind of streamline design questions. So one of the things that I find very useful, and I think I would like to hear more from you about, is sort of thinking about anticipated findings, because my sense is that what is important to learn about for the higher ed graduate labor market, what can we learn other than that a graduate degree is required? And this is partly a question about the structure of the labor market, but there are many jobs that require the credential. If you don't have the credential, you're not going to get a call back. So where is there movement in there? What's important to actually learn in that segment of the labor market? And then for the apprenticeship labor market, it seemed to me, based on my assumptions, that it's more of an open question regarding sort of which would be seen more favorably. And you mentioned in your talk that there's some data that actually dropping out gives you a slight advantage, at least initially. So we assume, I don't know, do we assume from that basically this is kind of a whatever set of assumptions about whatever skills you gain as being in higher ed for at least a period helps you in this apprenticeship market? Is that the way we should think about that evidence? And then one of the things that I think is really useful to think through, and in your proposal you had gender migration background and social class specifically, is thinking about interactions, thinking about what are the specific things that we would anticipate seeing in these results, and how does that vary by labor market segment, and sort of making concrete those assumptions as part of trying to understand how to drive design choices. Okay, so obviously a lot of kind of, you mentioned some of the potential mechanisms driving the effect of dropping out on how employers are interpreting vignettes or applications. So one obvious question is this question about the value of the credential for the graduate market segment. Employer perceptions of the skills that you gain during a degree, signals about personality. Why do people drop out? This competence versus commitment distinction. And this is actually comes up in that Padula tries to also parse in a project on gender, his project on gender and employment histories. You mentioned this role of cultural fit, sort of what what other assumptions are being made about dropouts and what it signals. One question is sort of about wage implications. Do you not hire someone without a credential because you can pay them less than someone with a credential? That's just sort of another market specific question. So we have this sort of bundle of potential mechanisms relevant to why we might observe these kinds of the existence of an effect or the lack of an effect. Okay, so I had a number of questions about the design and things. These are mostly things for you to think through. I'm sure you've thought through some of them you just discussed. In the proposal, you were proposing 4 dimensions, the sort of focal dimension being dropout status, and then 3 others, or maybe 2 others. But if I was, are you intending to do a fully cross design? So you're getting like 8 or between 6 and 8 plus conditions, and then doing this for each of the 4 subsamples that you laid out, and sort of thinking through the, what kind of response rates you actually need, what kind of N you actually need. That sort of scales very quickly, and sort of what using, some kind of proxy of like what your anticipated effect size is to be able to do a power analysis for the effects to try to figure this out. And then generally, I mean, again, this is sort of depends on labor market specific information, but concern about the response rates and recruitment to the project, especially for the Factorial survey in general. I had a number of questions about the Factorial survey, and I see that you're still grappling with them. And I think one question was just sort of clarifying what is the vignette other than a resume? Is there a narrative part of the vignette that is relevant versus just sort of this, more standardized resume format? And then sort of the same question you raise about the number of vignettes that you are trying to get employers to read. And one thought that I had is, and again, this is sort of, this would take out your 5th goal about trying to look at the specific relationship between the responses to the vignettes and behavioral outcomes, at least in the first phase. But I wondered whether starting with a design that is more along the lines of what Lauren Rivera did in her work, where you have employers narrate to you their interpretation of CVs or resumes as part of trying to get a purchase on mechanism, like as an initial step, even though obviously that's not the experimental step, but that would also allow you to, give them multiple versions of a resume and have more of a sense of, what are they paying attention to? What do they anchor on? How do they interpret being a dropout in light of other kinds of information about, migration background or gender, or whatever, just as a thought about phasing the project. This other question is also something that you're clearly grappling with, which is like sort of if a big goal is comparing the Factorial survey to the audit survey, are you doing that within employer? Or are you aggregating across types of employers and doing the comparison? So that's something obviously that you're trying to figure out. My sense is that the value of that contribution is higher if you're looking within employer, but as you noted, like the design features, the timing, sort of how you actually do that is much trickier. So here are some thoughts I had about how you might design the Factorial survey. assuming that part of what you want to do is to identify mechanisms by which this effect occurs, like what are some design features you might build into the factorial survey itself, as opposed to taking sort of a, approach where you also bring in more qualitative methods, at least at the beginning of the project. So I had this clarification question about, you talk about labor market segmentation in terms of the field of study, humanities versus science. And I assume you're using that as a proxy for types of occupations. So I wonder if it makes sense to not talk about the field of study, but talk about the occupations. And in particular, like, I assume your interest is in employers' understanding of these kinds of occupations in terms of how much like hard skills are required to do that. So I think just spelling out that kind of assumption, right? That like that distinction is about trying to draw on, assumptions about, presumably the value of dropping out. Let's see, I'm trying to figure out which direction it goes for like a science degree versus a humanities degree, but you acquire more hard skills the longer you stay in a science degree. So the value of the perception of the skills that you get from dropping out is different than a humanities degree, or whatever. It's sort of some kind of like more specific spelling out of that assumptions as a way of trying to understand like what role is employer perception of skill largely playing in decisions about the value of degree versus dropping out, or having some education versus going straight from high school. Some other thoughts about that is sort of thinking about whether you might leverage the timing of an application relative to the timing of dropping out to reduce the number of possible mechanisms at play, because sort of there's this like experience skill conflation in, there might be an experience skill conflation in some of these, depending on the structure of the design. For instance, like if you have, people applying a year or two out of dropping out or graduating and they have similar work experience, then you'd be able to kind of, establish how much of the effect is due to like the value of the credential versus the value of like your assumptions about its relationship to work experience, at least, and potentially something about skills. You talk a little bit about this in the proposal, but sort of also thinking about varying the amount of time in school as a proxy for skill acquisition or experience, as another way of kind of trying to get at mechanism. And then finally, thinking about other dependent variable measures you could use to better understand mechanisms, for example, sort of, employer impressions of candidates, either in a narrative form, or I think you just mentioned sort of having a dependent variable that asks more about the subjective evaluation of resumes. So sort of developing that set of dependent variables as well. So a couple final other thoughts is a question about, the current design, I think, looking at the similarity between recruiter and applicant is in an observational sense, you're not experimentally varying it. Sort of, I think this is another piece where you could think about phasing the project given how many things you have going on. But so I wondered about the value of using a measure of perceived similarity between a recruiter and applicant versus sort of these objective measures. And then I was interested in your predictions for variation in these effects by labor market segment and firm characteristics. And then finally, I think, you know, an outstanding question with this kind of work is, what's the short-term versus the long-term impact of, you know, this kind of different trajectories through education experience on work outcomes. And, you know, this may or may not be something that you're immediately interested in, but sort of thinking about timing, you know, early in career versus later in career, the effect of these differences in educational experience on employment outcomes. And I think that's it. Thanks.